The arbiter's crystalline body pulsed with multicolored light as it processed this unprecedented situation. "The council will recess for deliberation," it announced finally. "The human delegates will remain for questioning." Hours later, after intense debate and examination of their evidence, the outcome was clear. The conspirators were taken into custody. Emergency provisions were invoked to grant humanity provisional full membership status, with a formal ceremony to follow within the month. Later that night, away from the cameras and diplomats, Ilara stood on the observation deck of Vex's ship, overlooking the vast starfield beyond the station. The adrenaline of the day had finally worn off, leaving her exhausted but unable to sleep. The soft hiss of the door announced Vex's arrival. He joined her at the viewport, his reflection appearing beside hers in the transparent aluminum. "From homeless thief to savior of worlds," Vex said, joining her. "Quite a journey." Ilara smiled slightly, remembering the desperate girl she'd been just months ago. "I couldn't have done it without you believing in me in the end." "I never should have doubted you," he replied, his voice tinged with regret. "When I saw the evidence Soren had planted." "You were hurt, literally and figuratively," she said, "but you listened when it mattered." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Earth came into view, a blue-green jewel against the blackness of space, growing larger as their ship approached. "What happens now?" she asked. "The terraforming technology will be shared across the galaxy. Rayburn Industries will oversee implementation, ensuring no single species controls access." His hand found hers in the darkness. "And humanity will finally have a real voice in galactic affairs." "We're still just beginning," she replied, taking his hand as they looked toward Earth shining in the distance. No longer a backward planet, but the home of the galaxy's newest power. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that bridged the chasm between their former lives. The desperate thief and the driven businessman, both shaped by the same tragedy, both fighting in their own ways for survival. From the stars that had nearly destroyed them both, they had forged a future neither could have imagined alone. Their shared past had brought them together, but it was their shared vision that would carry them, and humanity, forward. As the ship continued its approach to Earth, they remained side by side, their reflections merging with the stars beyond the glass. Two survivors who had found not just each other, but a purpose greater than themselves. And in the vastness of the galaxy, that was perhaps the greatest discovery of all. Just 3 days earlier, Ilara had been in a prison cell awaiting trial. Her escape had required every skill she possessed, rewiring the cell's energy barrier using a dental implant she'd removed from her own mouth, navigating maintenance shafts too narrow for most aliens to follow, and finally stealing a maintenance vessel to reach the one person who might help her, Vex's former security chief who had retired after being replaced by Ilara. The old man had listened to her story, then shown her hidden footage he'd been collecting for years. Together, they had uncovered the truth and taken the evidence directly to Vex. Now she stood beside him, her prison clothes replaced by a formal suit that matched his own. They made no attempt to look submissive or grateful for the council's attention. They stood as equals, representatives of humanity with evidence too important to ignore. "Honored delegates," Vex began, his voice steady and confident. "For decades, humans have been tolerated rather than welcomed in galactic society. We've been told our technology is primitive, our understanding limited, our potential questionable." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Such directness was unusual in council proceedings, where political speech was typically wrapped in layers of formality. "Today, we stand before you with evidence of a conspiracy that has cost countless human lives and held back our entire species," Vex continued. "A conspiracy orchestrated at the highest levels of galactic governance." Ilara stepped forward and activated a small projector she held in her palm. Above them, a massive hologram materialized. Detailed records, communications, and visual evidence began to play. The attack on our colony 15 years ago, the sabotage of human businesses, and the recent bombing, all orchestrated by members of this very council, Vex declared, his voice rising with controlled anger. The hologram showed the destruction of New Terra colony, then shifted to reveal communications between consortium officials discussing the containment of human expansion. Next came footage from Rayburn Industries, showing Sorendell, Vex's trusted assistant, accessing restricted areas and planting explosive devices using Ilara's stolen security codes. For 15 years, elements within this council have systematically worked to suppress human advancement, Ilara explained. When sabotage and economic pressure proved insufficient, they turned to murder. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of sounds, denials, expressions of shock, angry rebuttals. The arbiter's crystalline form pulsed with bright red light as it called for order. "These are serious accusations," the arbiter stated once the noise subsided. "What evidence connects these events to council members?" Ilara nodded to Vex, who produced a small data crystal. "This contains financial records, communication logs, and DNA evidence linking 6 specific council members to the conspiracy. We've already transmitted copies to every delegation present and to media outlets across the galaxy." Panic spread through certain sections of the chamber. 2 delegates rose and attempted to leave but found the doors sealed. "We did not come here seeking justice for the past," Vex continued over the growing chaos. "We came to secure humanity's future." Ilara stepped forward again. "But today we present a new technology." She activated a small device clutched in her hand, and suddenly the massive terraforming model appeared above them, rotating slowly to display its intricate systems. A system that can restore dead worlds to life. The hologram showed barren planets transformed, dead oceans refilling, toxic atmospheres clearing, soil regenerating to support life once more. The detail and scale of the simulation left no doubt that this was not theoretical but fully realized technology. 37 worlds in consortium space are currently dying, Ilara explained. Another 63 face ecological collapse within a century. This technology can save them all. The council chamber erupted in shocked whispers as the implications became clear. Humanity now held the key to saving countless dying planets. Species that had looked down on humans for generations now faced the possibility of needing them desperately. "We do not offer this as a bargaining chip," Vex said, his voice cutting through the noise. "We offer it freely to any world that needs it. But in exchange, humanity must be granted full membership status in the consortium, with all rights and protections that entails." He remained on the other side of the energy barrier that separated them, his hands clasped behind his back. 12 people are dead, he said, his voice flat. 23 injured. The main laboratory is destroyed. 2 years of research gone. "I'm so sorry," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "But it wasn't me. Someone is setting me up. The security logs show your access codes being used at precisely 2247 to enter the restricted area. The bombs were planted inside the central coolant system, a vulnerability only top security personnel would know about." "Check the other cameras," Ilara insisted. "I was in my office at that time, reviewing footage from Docking Bay 7. "We did. There's a gap in your office surveillance." "Convenient," his voice hardened. "Your DNA was found on fragments of the detonator. Not just traces. Clear, complete samples, as if you'd handled it extensively." "Someone stole my DNA profile from the system," she argued, desperation creeping into her voice. "You know how easy that would be for someone with inside access." Vex's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. A momentary hesitation. "Was it all an act?" he asked quietly. "Were you working for them the whole time? Did they plant you, knowing I'd be intrigued by someone who could breach my security?" The question hurt worse than her physical injuries. After everything they'd shared, their connection over New Terra, the trust they'd built, the feelings that had grown between them, he could believe she would betray him like this. "Vex," she said, moving as close to the barrier as she dared, "think about what you're saying. Why would I help you stop 2 sabotage attempts only to commit a third? Why would I wait months to strike? It makes no sense. He didn't answer, but she saw conflict in his face now. Through the barrier, she whispered, "Look at the time stamps on the security footage. I couldn't have been in 2 places at once. Someone deleted the footage from my office, but there must be other cameras in that corridor that would show I never left." For a moment, she thought she was getting through to him. But then the door opened, and Vex's personal assistant entered. Soren Dow, with his perfect appearance and flawless record, had never hidden his disdain for Ilara. The assistant had been with Vex for 5 years and had clearly resented her rapid rise to a position of authority. "Mr. Rayburn," Soren said smoothly, "the emergency board meeting is starting. They cannot proceed without you." Vex nodded, his momentary uncertainty replaced by the hardened expression of a businessman dealing with a crisis. "I'll be right there," he replied. As they led her away down a separate corridor, Ilara caught sight of Vex's assistant smiling triumphantly beside him. The same assistant who had access to her codes, her DNA samples, and Vex's trust. The same assistant who had been absent during both previous sabotage attempts that she had thwarted. In that moment, with her wrists bound and her reputation destroyed, Ilara made a promise to herself. She would find a way to prove her innocence. She would expose whoever was really behind the attacks. And she would make Vex Rayburn regret ever doubting her. Because unlike the homeless girl he caught stealing months ago, the woman she had become didn't just survive, she fought back. The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Consortium was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings reached 50 meters high, supported by columns carved from rare metals found only on worlds most humans would never see. The delegates' seats rose in concentric circles, with the most powerful species occupying the innermost rings, a physical reminder of humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy. Today, however, the usual order had been disrupted. The emergency session had drawn representatives from all 200 member worlds, their varied anatomies and colorations creating a living tapestry of galactic diversity. Floating translation devices hovered near non-standard speakers, their soft blue glow adding to the chamber's otherworldly atmosphere. At the center of this gathering stood 2 humans, seemingly insignificant against the grand backdrop. Yet every eye, sensory appendage, and visual receptor in the room was fixed upon them. "The Council recognizes Vex Rayburn and Ilara Voss," announced the Galactic Arbiter, a tall, crystalline being whose transparent body refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. Its voice resonated through the chamber with perfect clarity. "And now you're doing the same thing," Ilara realized. "Your new project, it's based on my parents' research, isn't it? That's why the sabotage started." "Yes, and why I needed someone I could trust completely." His eyes held hers. Someone who would understand what's at stake. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with something more than shared history. For the first time, Ilara allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been feeling for weeks. "We should get back to work," she said softly, though she made no move to step away. "Probably," he agreed, equally still. Neither moved for a long moment, standing close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence, connected by their entwined fingers, and a shared determination that had just found its deeper purpose. Tomorrow, they would return to their professional roles, the brilliant executive and his capable security chief. But tonight, they were simply 2 survivors who had found each other against impossible odds. And in the vastness of space, such coincidences felt almost like destiny. The explosion rocked the entire station, bright enough to light up the darkness of space for a brief, terrible moment. The force shattered windows across 3 levels and triggered emergency containment fields throughout Nexus Station. Alarms wailed, and the central computer's calm voice repeated evacuation instructions as panicked residents rushed toward the escape pods. Ilara awoke to pain. Her head felt like it had been split open, and her mouth tasted of blood and chemicals. When she tried to move, she discovered her wrists were bound by energy cuffs that hummed with blue light. The walls around her were bare metal, Not the warm wood of her quarters at Rayburn Tower, but the cold, impersonal surface of a station holding cell. What happened? She croaked, her throat dry and raw. The last thing she remembered was working late in her office, reviewing security footage of a suspicious maintenance worker. The door slid open, revealing a tall Praxis alien in a station security uniform. The creature's gray skin was textured like rough stone, and its 4 eyes blinked out of sequence as it regarded her. "Prisoner Voss is conscious," it reported into a communicator on its wrist. "Where am I?" Ilara demanded, pulling herself into a sitting position despite the pain shooting through her skull. "Why am I restrained?" The alien's broad mouth twitched in what might have been disgust. Humans, always pretending ignorance. A second officer entered, this one human, but with the cold expression of someone who had long ago chosen to align himself with alien interests rather than human ones. "Ilara Voss," he read from a datapad. "You are being held on charges of industrial terrorism, sabotage, and attempted murder." "What?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's insane. I didn't do anything. Vex Rayburn has pressed charges against you for industrial sabotage and attempted murder," the alien officer announced, its voice clicking on the harder consonants. "Evidence links you to the bombing of the main laboratory." The words hit Ilara like physical blows. Bombing. The main laboratory. That's what the explosion had been. And Vex thought she was responsible. "That's impossible. I would never." "Your security codes were used to access restricted areas," the human officer interrupted. "Your DNA was found on the detonator device. The evidence is conclusive." Ilara shook her head, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "This makes no sense. I've spent months protecting Rayburn Industries from sabotage. Why would I suddenly become the saboteur?" The officers exchanged glances that made it clear they didn't care about her protests. "The arraignment will be tomorrow," the human officer said. "Until then, you remain in custody." They turned to leave, but Ilara called after them. "I need to speak to Vex. This is all a mistake. Someone has framed me." The alien officer paused at the door. "Mr. Rayburn has requested to see the prisoner. He will be here shortly." Relief flooded through her. Vex would sort this out. He knew her, trusted her. Whatever evidence they had, he would see through it. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door finally opened again. Vex stepped into the room, and Ilara's relief instantly turned to dread. His face was bruised on one side, with a bandage covering what must have been a serious cut. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit torn and stained with soot. But it was his eyes that terrified her, cold, distant, filled with a fury she had never seen directed at her before. "Vex," she began, rising to her feet. "I didn't do this. You have to believe me. Ms. Voss has credentials that matter more than formal education," Vex replied smoothly. "Results." Ilara maintained her composure during the conversation that followed, offering insights on the security concerns of the mining operation that clearly surprised the minister. By the time they'd moved on, the alien was looking at her with new respect. "You handled that perfectly," Vex said as they walked away. 3 months ago, you were picking scraps from trash compactors. Now you're debating resource allocation with one of the consortium's top ministers." "I'm a quick study," she replied with a small smile. "And I had a good teacher." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Ilara looked away first, suddenly conscious of her racing heart. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. By midnight, most guests had departed, leaving only the cleaning staff preparing to restore the ballroom to its usual state. "I should check the security logs before turning in," Ilara said, moving toward the exit. "Actually," Vex said, "would you mind joining me in my office first? There's something I want to show you." Curious, she followed him to the private elevator that led to the uppermost floor of Rayburn Tower. His office occupied half the level, with panoramic views of the station and space beyond. Unlike the opulent public spaces, this room was surprisingly simple. A large desk, comfortable chairs, and walls lined with actual paper books, a rarity in the digital age. Vex walked to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a small, worn silver case. Ilara waited patiently as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "Today marks 3 months since you joined Rayburn Industries," he said finally. "You've exceeded every expectation." "Just doing the job you hired me for," she replied, though his praise warmed her. "No, you've done far more." He opened the case, and Ilara was surprised to see it contained old-fashioned printed photographs. Actual photographs, not holograms or digital displays. Vex stared down at them, his expression suddenly distant. For a moment, he looked vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. This was not the confident businessman who commanded respect throughout the station, but a man haunted by something painful. "Who are they?" she asked gently, moving closer to see. The photograph showed a smiling family, a woman with kind eyes holding a baby, a young boy of perhaps 7 or 8, and a teenage Vex, looking carefree in a way that seemed impossible compared to the man he'd become. "My family," he said quietly. "My mother, my little brother, and me. They died when our colony was attacked. The same attack that orphaned you." Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What? How could you know that?" "New Terra Colony," he said, watching her reaction carefully. 15 years ago. You mentioned it once, when you were half asleep during a late security review. You said you were from there." Ilara's hands trembled slightly. She rarely spoke of her past, and never of New Terra. The memories were too painful. The screams, the burning buildings, the ships descending from the sky with weapons blazing. "You were there too," she whispered. He nodded. "I was 16, away at a special science program on Earth when it happened. I came back to nothing. No family, no home." "I was only 7, she said. "My parents, they hid me in a storage compartment. I heard everything. When it was over, there was no one left. I've been searching for survivors for 15 years, he revealed, setting the photographs down carefully. "There were supposed to be evacuation ships. Some people must have gotten out." Suddenly, so much made sense. His drive, his ambition, his determination to push humanity forward. "That's why you built all this. To find them. To make sure it never happens again," he corrected, his hand brushing against hers on the desk. "To make humans strong enough that no species would dare attack us like that again." The touch sparked something neither expected, a connection that transcended their different worlds. They were both survivors of the same tragedy, shaped by the same loss. Despite their different paths, they understood each other in a way no one else could. The official report said it was a reactor malfunction, Ilara said, not pulling her hand away from his. "But I saw the ships. They weren't human." "I know," Vex replied, his fingers gently closing around hers. The consortium covered it up. New Terra was developing technology that would have advanced humanity too quickly for their comfort, so they eliminated the threat. "There's a shower through that door," he said, gesturing to another part of the room. "Get cleaned up, get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." "And if I refuse?" Ilara asked, lifting her chin. Vex studied her for a moment. "The door isn't locked. You can leave any time. But I'm offering you a chance to do something meaningful instead of just surviving day to day." He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. "Oh, and the quantum communicator you stole. It's yours now. Consider it an advance on your salary." After he left, Ilara explored the room cautiously, half expecting some trap. The shower beckoned with the promise of hot water, a luxury she'd almost forgotten. She stood under the spray for nearly an hour, watching years of grime swirl down the drain. The soap smelled like real flowers, not the synthetic scents available in public facilities. Clean for the first time in months, and dressed in soft, new clothes, she sat on the edge of the enormous bed, turning the quantum communicator over in her hands. It was worth enough to live comfortably for a year. She could sell it, disappear to another station. But something about Vex's offer nagged at her. The chance to be more than just another human scraping by. The chance to matter. As she contemplated her options, a glint of light caught her eye. Something reflective in the corner of the ceiling. Ilara stood on the bed for a closer look and found a tiny camera, nearly invisible against the ornate molding. Her first thought was anger. He was spying on her after all. But as she examined the room more carefully, she found more cameras, all positioned to monitor the entrances and perimeter. None were aimed at the bed or bathroom. They weren't watching her. They were watching for threats to her. Curious now, she pried open the casing of one camera with her fingernail. The technology inside was far more advanced than simple surveillance equipment. These were security devices with built-in weapon capabilities, the kind used to protect high-value assets. That night, as she lay in the most comfortable bed she'd ever known, Ilara realized something unsettling. The cameras weren't just protecting her from abstract threats. Vex Rayburn believed someone or something was watching from the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And he brought her right into the middle of it. For the first time in years, Ilara felt something beyond the constant struggle to survive. It wasn't exactly fear, and it wasn't exactly excitement. It was purpose. Tomorrow, she decided, she would accept his offer. Not for the money or the comfort, but because for once, she wanted to build something instead of just stealing it. 3 months later, Ilara stood beside Vex at the company gala, unrecognizable in her elegant dress. The deep blue fabric shimmered like the night sky, tiny crystals catching the light like stars. Her once matted hair now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Clean, well-fed, and confident, she bore little resemblance to the desperate thief Vex had caught in his docking bay. The grand ballroom of Rayburn Tower soared above them, its transparent ceiling offering a view of Nexus Station's upper rings and the vast cosmos beyond. Servers carrying exotic delicacies weaved among the attendees, wealthy humans mingling with representatives from a dozen alien species. Ilara noticed the stares and whispers that followed them. A 7-foot-tall Xorian ambassador leaned down to murmur something to his companion, their 4 eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away when she caught them. They still don't believe a former homeless girl could be your chief security officer, she murmured to Vex, keeping her practiced smile in place. In the 3 months since accepting his offer, she had transformed Rayburn Industries' security protocols. Her street-level understanding of how systems could be hacked had helped her build defenses that actually worked. The company's stock had risen 15% since the sabotage attempts stopped. "Let them talk," Vex replied, his voice low and warm beside her ear. "You've already stopped 2 sabotage attempts." His hand rested lightly at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd. The casual touch sent a flutter through her stomach that she tried to ignore. Their relationship was professional. She reminded herself of this daily. "Mr. Rayburn," called out a tall, willowy alien with silver skin that reflected the light in rainbow patterns. "I was hoping to discuss the mining rights on Proxima B." "Minister Thalix," Vex acknowledged with a respectful nod. "I'd be delighted, but first let me introduce my chief security officer, Ilara Voss." The alien's vertical pupils widened slightly as they regarded her. "Ah yes, your unexpected appointment. Quite unusual to promote someone with no formal credentials to such a position." Ilara nodded, uncomfortably aware of her ragged appearance and the stark difference between them. She was nothing in this world, just another human struggling to survive on a station dominated by species who saw her kind as primitives barely worth noticing. And yet something in the way he looked at her had changed. For the first time in years, Vex Rayburn smiled. Not the practiced smile seen in media broadcasts or business meetings, but something genuine that softened his face and made him look younger. "What's your name?" he asked. The question hung between them, unexpected and somehow important. The alarms still blared around them, but neither moved. This moment felt like a turning point, though Ilara couldn't have explained why. "Ilara," she answered finally. "Ilara Voss." The man who owned planets nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Well, Ilara Voss," he said, reaching slowly into his pocket, "I think we need to talk." The quantum communicator in her hand suddenly seemed less important than whatever would come next. Ilara couldn't stop staring at the room around her. The ceiling soared 3 times higher than any space she'd ever lived in. Real wood paneling, actual wood from Earth, covered the walls. The bed looked bigger than the entire alcove she'd been sleeping in for the past 6 months. A food synthesizer hummed quietly in the corner, capable of producing any meal she could imagine. Through the massive window, the endless expanse of stars stretched out, no longer the distant pinpricks she glimpsed from the station's public viewing ports, but a panoramic vista of the universe. This was how the rich lived. This was how Vex Rayburn lived. She folded her arms across her chest, suddenly conscious of her grimy clothes and unwashed skin. The security guards had escorted her here directly from the docking bay. And though no one had said she was under arrest, Ilara knew better than to believe she was free to leave. "I don't need your charity," she said when Vex finally entered the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. He'd removed his jacket, and his white shirt sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing strong forearms. Up close, she could see the subtle signs of exhaustion on his face, the slight shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "It's not charity. It's a job offer," he replied, walking further into the room. "Someone with your skills could save my company." Ilara laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to her own ears. A street rat working for Rayburn Industries. The aliens already mock humans enough. She'd seen how the other species looked at humans, with barely concealed disdain. Humans were the newcomers to interstellar society, centuries behind most other races in technological development. Only in the last 50 years had Earth managed to establish a modest presence beyond their solar system, and much of that progress was due to the man standing before her. "That's exactly why I need you," Vex said, reaching for a small device in his pocket. He pressed a button, and suddenly the air between them filled with light. A hologram materialized, showing complex machinery torn apart from the inside. Components lay scattered, melted in places, precisely damaged in others. Another image appeared, a ship with its engine core exposed and clearly sabotage. Then another, a research facility with its main computer banks destroyed. "Someone is destroying everything I've built," Vex continued, his voice growing harder. "The consortium doesn't want humans gaining power." Ilara studied the images, her technical mind automatically analyzing the damage patterns. This wasn't random. Look at the precision cuts on the power couplings. Someone knew exactly where to strike. "Yes," Vex agreed, seemingly pleased by her quick assessment. "Someone with insider knowledge and access." Ilara circled the hologram, momentarily forgetting her situation as her mind worked through the problem. "But why target you specifically? There are other human businesses." "None that threaten to elevate our species' standing," Vex replied. "My next project would change everything. It would force the consortium to acknowledge humans as equals." The consortium, 6 ancient alien species who controlled most of the galaxy's trade routes, resources, and governing bodies. They tolerated humans as long as they remained in their designated place. The bottom. Ilara turned back to him, suspicion returning. "Why tell me this? Why trust me? I tried to rob you." "Because you're the first person who's outsmarted my security in 5 years," he said, shutting off the hologram. "And we humans need to stick together." He approached a wall panel and pressed his palm against it. A hidden compartment slid open, revealing a selection of clothes, all new, all her size. The alarm blared through Nexus Station's pristine corridors, its sound slicing through the usual hum of machinery and alien conversations. Red lights flashed along the white walls as security drones deployed from their charging stations, their metallic bodies gleaming as they swarmed toward the luxury docking bay like angry insects. Ilara pressed her thin body against the cold metal wall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The stolen quantum communicator felt heavy in her dirty hands, its sleek design a stark contrast to her filthy fingernails and tattered clothes. She hadn't showered in weeks, and her dark hair hung in greasy strands around her pale face. 3 days without food had made her desperate enough to attempt the impossible. Her stomach had stopped growling yesterday, replaced by a hollow ache that made thinking difficult. The station's automated waste disposal units had yielded nothing edible, and the alien merchants in the lower markets had chased her away with threats. This heist wasn't just about hunger. It was about survival. Just need to reach Section 8, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the alarm. Then I can slip through the maintenance tunnels. The quantum communicator would fetch enough credits on the black market to eat for months, maybe even rent a small sleeping pod. Technology like this, capable of instant communication across light years, was worth more than most Nexus residents earned in a year. Ilara checked the hallway, saw it was momentarily clear, and darted across the polished floor. Her worn boots made no sound. Years of avoiding detection had taught her to move like a shadow. The exit was just ahead, a service door that would lead to the less monitored areas of the station. 3 more steps and she'd be safe. Stop right there, a deep voice commanded from behind. The words hit her like a physical blow. Ilara froze, her muscles tensing as if preparing to spring, but she knew running was pointless now. Slowly, she turned around. Standing before her was Vex Rayburn himself, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit that highlighted his broad shoulders. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his clean-shaven face bore the weathered look of a man who had seen too much too young. The most powerful human in the galaxy had caught her red-handed. His security detail was nowhere to be seen. He stood alone, his posture relaxed but alert, like a predator confident in its abilities. Ilara had seen his face on nearly every screen in the station. Vex Rayburn, the human who had built a fortune from nothing, whose ships traveled to the farthest reaches of known space. The man who had given humanity a seat at the table among the older, more advanced alien species. "Do you know what you just stole?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Those eyes, a startling blue that seemed to look straight through her disguises and defenses. Ilara considered lying but decided against it. Men like Rayburn didn't get to where they were by being easily fooled. "Something worth enough credits to eat for a month," she replied, chin raised despite her fear. She would not cower, even facing certain imprisonment. Pride was all she had left. She expected anger, perhaps even violence. Rich men weren't known for their mercy, especially when stolen from. Instead, Rayburn's expression shifted to something resembling curiosity. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor. Ilara forced herself not to step back. "The security on this docking bay includes motion sensors, heat detectors, and DNA scanners," he said, studying her face with unexpected intensity. "There are 26 drones programmed to detect unauthorized access, and the door codes change every 90 seconds. Ilara said nothing, clutching the communicator tighter. "And somehow," he continued, "a girl who looks like she hasn't eaten in days managed to get past all of it." His tone wasn't accusatory but genuinely puzzled. This surprised Ilara more than his presence. "How did you bypass my security?" "Those systems were designed by the finest Arcturian engineers. They assured me they were unbreachable." Ilara hesitated. The truth might earn her a worse punishment, or it might be her only chance at mercy. "I rewired the authentication protocols using scrap parts from the trash compactor," she said simply. "The recycling unit on level 3 throws out circuit boards that still have some life in them. I built a signal duplicator that mimics authorized access codes." Rayburn's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "You built a signal duplicator from garbage," he repeated, as if testing the words.